He was a very violent man. He must have snapped at the last minute.
She's got to get out of this burning house or else die in the house.
Screaming, your father's been shot, your father's been shot.
If I get those guys, I'm gonna kill them.
A woman is savagely murdered, and the man jailed for the crime insists he's innocent. But if he didn't do it, who did?
It's got to be somebody, and I knew that all along.
Then a young father is cut down in cold blood. But when connections to the mob and drugs surface, will a son's investigation lead to the truth or more tragedy?
It had all the earmarks of a hit. I remember telling my mom that I would find the killers.
What happened? It's hard to believe. I know in my heart he shot.
We had to find some answers.
Let it go unsolved.
Open.
Figure out who did that.
The investigation.
I needed justice.
Crucial information.
Never gonna give up.
I tried to do everything I could.
May 23rd, 1991. In the small rural town of Auburn, New York, volunteer firefighters arrive at a landmarked farmhouse engulfed in flames.
Most of the front of the house is burnt. It was pretty well, I'd say almost gutted.
But there's no sign of anyone inside, so one of the firefighters begins a search of the surrounding area, and it isn't long before he stumbles onto a grisly scene.
Maybe 30, 40 yards up this dirt lane was the body of the victim.
The victim is 49-year-old Sabina Kulakowski, a social worker who lives at the farmhouse.
She was covered in blood, totally nude. She'd been stabbed numerous times. Total strangers just don't kill like that.
The brutality of Sabina Kulakowski's murder shocks the town of Auburn and the police.
While inspecting the body, we noticed one bite mark. Later on, several other bite marks were discovered.
A torn red T-shirt is also found a few yards away from Sabina's body.
The T-shirt, I surmised, was ripped off of her during this confrontation. It was quite soiled.
Investigators immediately track down the person closest to Sabina, her ex-boyfriend, Ronald Bench. He's the oldest son of a family well known in the area.
The Bench family was a fine, upstanding farm family for years out in the town of Aurelius.
Ron and Sabina had been living together for 17 years. Ron farmed the land while Sabina worked for county social services. Then, 3 weeks before the murder, the relationship fell apart.
We found out that he had recently gone to live with another woman in Auburn.
Ron claims the breakup was amicable, but police learned that he and Sabina had been fighting over the farmhouse, and recently, Sabina threatened to take him to court.
We heard that she was going to contact a lawyer about what she can do about dividing up their property.
Ron Bench quickly informs investigators that he has an alibi.
His only alibi was that he was at home in the presence of this woman that he was living with in Auburn.
But Koecker has his doubts.
To tell you the truth, my gut was telling me that Ron Bench could be a good, strong suspect.
Still, Ron has never been known to behave violently. And why would he burn down his own farmhouse? Meanwhile, investigators begin questioning Sabina's friends and co-workers, looking for anyone with a record of violence or mental instability. They soon learn that someone threatened the life of Sabina's boss a year earlier over a child custody case, a man named Roy Brown.
He took custody of my daughter when I was out of town. And we got into a phone argument. I said, well, how about if I come out there and shoot you? I didn't have a gun or anything. I just was upset.
The threat to Sabina's boss earns the 30-year-old single father 8 months in prison. Then, just 1 week before Sabina is murdered, Brown is released.
A few days after I was out of jail, a social worker got murdered. That's when it all started.
By all accounts, Brown has had a hard luck life, dropping out of school in the 5th grade and fathering his first child at 14. So far, much of his time has been devoted to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. But recently, Brown has been trying to turn things around for the sake of his 8-year-old daughter, April.
And then I was working on houses, remodeling houses. And, kind of like little side jobs here and there, whatever I could do to make a living.
When the police question him, Roy insists he's innocent, but he has no alibi for the night Sabina was murdered.
That was the end of that visit. They came back repeatedly 2 more times. The 3rd time they said to me, not to leave town.
Then, 5 days after the murder, police tell Roy they want to check his bite against the marks found on the victim.
They took me to a dentist. They made a mold of my mouth. After I gave them the samples, I figured, well, they'll go into the laboratory and they'll test and see that I have nothing to do with it.
But just 4 days later, the police come to arrest Roy Brown for murder.
I was scared like hell. This is a serious thing. They're talking about putting me in trial and convicting me and sending me to prison for the rest of my life for a crime I didn't do.
Roy's trial begins on January 13, 1992, 8 months after Sabina Kulakowski's murder. Prosecutors waste no time calling their first witness, Roy's ex-wife, who claims he'd bitten her in the past.
They come up saying, oh, you bit your ex-wife, and I never bit anybody in my life. So it's my word against theirs.
But the most persuasive evidence the state has is testimony that Roy's teeth resemble the bite marks on the victim.
The dental mold is what they relied on, just the dental mold.
The case is far from open and shut, but Roy's lawyers feel they need more evidence to convince a jury that he's innocent. They want to compare the DNA in Roy's saliva to the DNA in the saliva found on Sabina's t-shirt. But there's a problem.
At the time, DNA testing was very crude. It was very expensive.
In fact, the tests will cost Roy $17,000.
But I didn't have any money for a DNA testing.
After 2 weeks of testimony, the case goes to the jury. And just 8 hours later, they deliver their verdict.
The jury found me guilty of murder.
Roy Brown is sentenced to 25 years to life in prison.
It was devastating. I'm sitting there thinking, I'm going to jail for the rest of my life. This is the end right here.
But it isn't long before the case takes its first of many startling turns. Shortly after Roy is sentenced, his lawyers get an anonymous phone call about evidence that never made it into trial.
They found the bootprint was actually under part of her body. This would have to be the perpetrator's bootprint.
Despite his claims of innocence, Roy Brown has just been sentenced to life in prison for the brutal murder of Sabina Kulakowski. But now an anonymous phone call to his attorney's office threatens to change everything.
They left a file somewhere with this copy of this evidence in it, and my lawyers went and picked it up at this meeting place and found out that the killer's bootprint size was 13.5.
Roy Brown has a very small foot, an 8.5, and this was a footprint from a person with a large foot.
And the first thing that struck my mind is Ron Bench was a very big man, and he looked like he wore a size 13.5.
Ron Bench is Sabina Kulakowski's ex-boyfriend, and given the circumstances, Roy has always suspected that Ron is the real killer.
The killer had to be somebody that knew the property like the back of his hand. I'm thinking to myself, this Ron Bench boyfriend, ex-boyfriend, may have killed her and is just letting me take the rap for it.
Roy's lawyers immediately file an appeal, arguing that the footprint could have changed the outcome of his case.
The jury should have seen it. It was that crucial.
For the next year, Roy waits for the appeal to be answered by the judge.
Your hopes build up that, hey, this is gonna be it. This is gonna wake them up. This is gonna show them that I didn't do this crime.
But when the ruling finally comes in, Roy's appeal is rejected. The judge contends that there's no proof the footprint would have affected the jury's decision. It's a bitter disappointment for Roy, The years of being imprisoned seem to stretch endlessly before him.
I mean, you're locked in a cage, but you got to leave that cage to go to lunch, to go to breakfast, to go to the yard. You have to adjust to the people around you, and it's full of evil.
But Roy remains determined to prove his innocence. Since his conviction, the science of DNA analysis has made huge strides. Roy and his lawyers file a motion arguing that the saliva found at the crime scene be tested for DNA.
I had had my hopes up that I'd get a new trial or the jury or something, somebody to look at this.
But the motion is once again denied. During the next 4 years, Roy and his lawyers appeal to higher courts, but the answer is always the same: no. By the winter of 1995, the case has reached a dead end.
They told me there was nothing they could actually do, and I didn't have any more attorneys.
Roy learns that he has one option left: file a federal petition arguing that his constitutional rights were violated. But with his legal team dispersed, Roy will have to do it on his own.
That's when I decided to take the law into my own hands and start investigating it myself. And I started studying the law, but it's a long process of learning. I didn't have much of an education as it was. I went to the 5th grade.
He said sometimes he used to have to read a paragraph 20 times before he would understand it.
Roy throws himself into the petition writing process, but just a few months later, he's dealt a blow that makes the rest of his problems pale in comparison.
I started getting sick one day. Just had a stomach ache and felt really tired and dizzy. So I went and seen a doctor. They said that I had hepatitis. They told me that I was real bad.
Doctors also inform him that he'll eventually need a liver transplant to survive. But there's a problem.
You can't get a transplant in jail. And, the doctors have already told me my time is short.
With a new sense of urgency, Roy returns to the case files, looking for anything that might shed light on his predicament. Then, buried in a forensic document, he uncovers a detail that may be significant.
Reddish-brown residue was found on this woman's body. Ron Bench, in his statement to the police, he said he was working on his farm tractor the night that she was murdered. Well, I'm thinking he's got reddish-brown residue on his hands from working on the tractor, and she's got this reddish-brown residue on her body that it could have been him.
Roy's next step is to request copies of every document ever filed in his case from the sheriff's office. But when they arrive, he can hardly believe his eyes. Near the top of the stack is a complete list of every witness ever interviewed in the investigation.
I looked at this list, and there's 17 names on there that have never been mentioned in the media, never in a newspaper, never in a trial transcript, not by anybody anywhere in the world.
And among those 17 names, one jumps out at him.
And I just could not believe it. Now, I could show them I ain't got nothing to do with that crime. But I knew that someday that my innocence was going to get proved.
It's been 12 years since Roy Brown was imprisoned for savagely murdering Sabina Kulakowski. But now, for the first time, Roy's gotten a look at the complete list of statements taken by police.
Of course, Ron Bench was there, but he had a missing brother nobody mentioned, Barry Bench.
We never heard the name Barry Bench before. Never mentioned it.
And it's the information regarding Barry Bench that jumps off the page. Barry is Ron's younger brother, a volunteer firefighter.
I found that he was a very, very violent man, especially towards women. He was the one that had a history of biting people in the past.
In fact, Barry's live-in girlfriend, Tamra Heisner, had taken an order of protection out against him at the time. But on the night of the murder, Barry defies it and comes to see her, just minutes down the road from the farmhouse where Sabina died.
He was at Tammy's house, and they had an argument. And he shoved her around some. He assaulted her. And then he went to Jake's Tavern, and he had quite a few beers.
Barry tells police investigators that he left the tavern at 12 and returned to the firehouse.
This affidavit from Barry Bench put him in the vicinity of the crime, the night of the crime, near the time of the crime.
Roy can't believe what he's reading. Could it be possible that all these years he's been chasing the wrong brother? Roy immediately files a motion to overturn his conviction and sends it with the affidavits to the judge.
Well, the judge denied my motion. I got legal mail served, overnight express. That's how fast he denied it.
But Roy refuses to give up. With the legal options exhausted, he decides to take the fight directly to his new suspect. That same week, he mails a letter off to Barry Bench.
And I told him that I might not be able to get DNA tested on myself, but I'm gonna get DNA tested on you. And I think about 4 or 5 days later, the correction officers came to my cell, and they said the sergeant wanted to see me. And I went down to the sergeant's office, and he had a copy of the letter that I sent.
Roy can see his letter has had an impact, but nothing could have prepared him for what the sergeant says next.
I find out he kills himself.
As it turns out, Barry Bench had stepped in front of an Amtrak train just 2 days earlier, and Roy's letter was found on the front seat of his truck.
Obviously didn't prove his guilt, but it was pretty compelling, the timing on that.
My main concern was, wait a minute, if he's dead, I can't get DNA tested on him.
I really wanted somebody with the DNA expertise, so I wrote a letter to the Innocence Project and I begged them to take this case.
The Innocence Project is an organization devoted to using DNA evidence to freeing wrongfully convicted inmates. And after reading Katie's letter, they agreed to take the case. It's good news, but the clock is ticking for Roy. The hepatitis he's been suffering from is getting worse, and prison doctors have told him that without a liver transplant, he has less than a year to live.
So I'm preparing everything so that my family can continue on to prove my innocence after I'm gone. As long as I knew someday that I'd be cleared, I could die in prison.
The Innocence Project soon hires a private investigator, and he quickly locates Barry Bench's girlfriend, Tamra Heisner.
When the investigator started asking her about what had happened, it was clear that in hindsight she was really starting to wonder if Barry Bench could have been the person that committed this horrible crime.
Tamra and Barry Bench have a daughter named Catherine, and after hearing about her mother's suspicions, she makes a decision that will change Roy's life forever.
So she, out of nowhere, volunteered blood samples to see if the DNA from her would match the killer's saliva.
The Innocence Project, through their resources and their contacts, had test results from a DNA test back in about 5 days.
On December 5th, 2006, my lawyer said, well, we got the DNA test done finally, and it shows that you didn't do it. But it also shows that Barry Bench is her father, and he killed Sabina Kulakowski.
Investigators are convinced that Barry acted alone, and Ron Bench never had any knowledge of the crime. But this raises a key question. Why would Barry want to kill his brother's girlfriend? As Roy's legal team prepares a motion to overturn his conviction, they're able to piece together the chain of events that led directly to Sabina Kulakowski's tragic death. And it all started with the Bench family farm.
The father, Gerald Bench, gave the property to Ron Bench. And Barry Bench always thought that property should have been his.
Barry resents it even more when Ron allows Sabina to live in the house after their breakup.
This is the Bench family farm, and if he couldn't have it, no one was gonna have it.
The night of the murder, Barry's ex-girlfriend Tamra locks him out of their house. Drunk and furious, he's a time bomb waiting to go off.
He left the house angry and drove to the Bench family farmhouse.
Unfortunately, it's the one place where his anger is sure to get the better of him. At the farmhouse, he runs into Sabina, and the encounter quickly turns violent. Barry sets fire to the house, probably leaving Sabina for dead inside. But she comes to and runs out.
She is reconfronted by the perpetrator. She is manhandled the stabbing starts. She puts up somewhat of a fight, and she's killed outside that house and up that laneway.
On January 23, 2007, in front of Roy's entire family and a packed crowd of supporters, a judge finally frees him.
It wasn't about getting out of jail. It was, you know, I can die tomorrow and I ain't got a care in the world. Getting out of prison is secondary to proving your innocence.
Roy walks out of the courthouse, a free but very sick man.
At that time, I'm living about 8 months past my death sentence from the doctor. I weighed like 100 pounds.
The next few months bring the 46-year-old to the brink of death. Then, in May 2007, his cell phone rings. It's the transplant center.
We got the phone call about a liver becoming available.
Within 6 hours, he undergoes transplant surgery. The procedure is successful, and Roy makes a full, nearly miraculous recovery.
It was a different person. He looked alive again. His eyes were bright blue with white around them instead of yellow around him, and you could just tell he was back.
Today, Roy is planning a wedding to his childhood sweetheart. He sees his grown children regularly.
Prison doesn't wash off. It doesn't go away. When I left prison, I left a part of myself there, and I took a part of it with me. I'm not the same person that I was, you know, and I'll never be the same person I was again. In some ways, I think I'm better as a person, and in some ways, I think I'm not.
Roy Brown's life depended on him proving his innocence for a crime he didn't commit. But when a father is murdered, will a son's investigation set him free or serve as the instrument of his own undoing? Sunday, January 2nd, 1972, a bar in Fresno, California.
My father had some business to do there. He was there alone in the back.
The place is empty, except for the bartender.
Two men entered the business. They were dressed in overcoats and wearing gloves.
The next thing the bartender hears is gunshots. 1, 2, 3.
15-year-old Mark Arax is watching TV with his younger brother and sister when the phone rings.
My brother answered the phone, gave the phone to my mom, and the next thing I heard were screams. Your father's been shot, your father's been shot. I remember the neighbors coming and staying with my sister and my brother, and my mom and I went to the hospital.
The next hour is excruciating for the family as a team of surgeons work feverishly to bring Era back from the brink.
The doctor came out and shook his head. It didn't work. My dad bled to death.
There in the waiting room, his son Mark makes a vow that will haunt him for the rest of his life.
That night in that room, basically my childhood ended and my adulthood began. I remember telling my mom that I would find the killers.
40-year-old Era Arax has just been gunned down in the Fresno nightclub he owned, leaving behind his wife and 3 kids, including his 15-year-old son, Mark.
My father was much loved, was very passionate, just full of life.
Era grew up in a traditional Armenian family, but not content to run the family grocery store. In 1965, he bought a bar and named it Era's Apartments.
It wasn't that big of a place, but it was a hopping place.
The nightclub was the most popular nightclub in the San Joaquin Valley, and a lot of the big spenders in that nightclub were drug smugglers.
The police immediately declare Era Arax's case a homicide, and detectives head to his nightclub to interview the bartender, the only eyewitness. She tells them she saw 2 men, complete strangers, walk into the empty bar around 6:15 p.m.
She said they were very good looking, and she said that there was something about them that told her that they were from out of town. They had long sideburns, hair parted down the middle, mustaches, young, in their mid-20s. They walked to the back room to play a game of pool. In doing so, they walked right past my dad's open office where he's working on some books.
Minutes later, the bartender hears gunshots and ducks behind the bar for cover. When she gets up, the men are gone and Era is lying in a pool of blood.
He was shot in the head, in the stomach, in the leg, in the arm.
She told the police that no money had been taken, no demand for money had been made.
The detectives are able to quickly rule out robbery as a motive. The killing was fast and ruthless, like a murder for hire or retaliation.
It had all the earmarks of a hit.
Searching for a motive, the detectives consider a drug angle to the crime. The police know Era's club and are well aware that it is overrun with people who have ties to drug dealers.
Some of the bartenders were involved in these drug smuggling rings. The bar manager was involved in some of the drug smuggling rings. The patrons were involved.
Could Era have gotten involved with drugs and been killed as part of a deal gone bad?
That to me seemed impossible, because he had preached against it. He was a Little League coach for Crime 86.
The investigators scour the scene for clues and soon find 2 sets of fingerprints.
They had removed their gloves to play pool. There were usable latent fingerprints that were lifted from a pool ball.
And right there, you had a fingerprint. You were starting from something.
But without a suspect, the fingerprints are useless. While the police continue their investigation, the family lays Era to rest in Fresno's Armenian cemetery.
The funeral director said it was the largest funeral he's ever seen. People came from every walk of life.
These old Armenian survivors of genocide mixed in with Hell's Angels and bartenders and Little League coaches. It was really my dad's life right there.
Also at the funeral are some detectives, and as Mark stands at his father's grave, he overhears one of them whispering to his partner.
I could hear him saying, "Is this a mafia funeral or what?"
For the first time, Mark begins to wonder if his father could have been involved in something dirty, like drug dealing or even the mob.
I knew very early on that there was this possibility that my dad led a double life.
He was involved in this business that involved, you might say, a shady element of the community.
Who was Era Iraq's really? An upstanding citizen or a gangster? A loving father or a man involved with drugs? Who wanted him dead and why?
I do remember for quite a while living in fear, living with the drapes drawn, never knowing if the person that killed my dad was after us.
We weren't sure who was after my father, if somehow that we were in danger.
It's been 6 weeks since 40-year-old Era Iraqs was brutally gunned down in his own nightclub. Era's bar was a magnet for drug dealers, and there are suspicions that he was involved in the mob. But the lead police detective has a hunch that it's more personal.
He concocted this theory that my mom was having an affair with one of my dad's business partners, and that somehow she had set up the murder.
But Mark's mother is one of only hundreds of people the police question.
They questioned my father's bar manager, a guy that owned about 15% of the bar. They questioned the cocktail waitresses, some patrons.
But none of the numerous interviews they conduct turn up any clues. As the months pass with no progress, Mark's mother and siblings begin to accept the idea that the murderers may never be caught. But Mark does not, and it isn't long before the 15-year-old starts investigating on his own.
He wanted to find who did this, to make some sense of it. You know, if I get those guys, I'm going to kill them.
Late one night, Mark sneaks into his father's study and begins going through his private papers. Most of it is just mundane business correspondence. But as he thumbs through his father's date book, he comes across a startling clue. It seems that only days before he was killed, Era had a meeting at the Fresno Police Department.
I wanted to know what my father was doing down at the police department a day or two before the murder, who he was seeing, what the subject of those meetings were.
Brimming with questions, Mark decides to contact the police. He knows his mother is afraid of Era's killers, so he doesn't tell her he's investigating on his own. Grabbing a tape recorder, he tiptoes into the bathroom to make the call. But just as the phone begins to ring, his mother bursts in.
She said, "Who are you talking to?" And I just couldn't lie on the spot.
At that point in time, she made him promise not to do any further investigating. She was afraid for his safety.
So I put the notebook away.
Mark does his best to put his father's death out of his mind. In the ensuing years, he graduates from college, gets married, starts a family, and lands a job as a journalist at a major newspaper on the East Coast. Although he's haunted by his father's death, he does nothing about it until he gets bad news from home in 1984.
I got a call from my mom that she'd been sick and she had cancer. And so I quit my job and returned home.
The doctor did say that it was a stress-related lung cancer. It took her life in 6 months.
Flora Arax is just 51 years old. She dies without knowing who killed her husband. Grieving but freed from his promise, Mark relocates his wife and 2-year-old daughter to Fresno. He's determined to fulfill the vow he made as a teenager and find the man who killed his father.
I think the greatest challenges for Mark was just the time. You know, there had been a number of years that had gone by, and you know, how can you really get the true story from some of these seedy characters?
For years, Fresno has had a reputation for drugs, gambling, and prostitution, all kept in place through police and political corruption.
Some of the folks that I was looking at were powerful people that could be dangerous.
His first step is securing the police report, which is 300 pages long. From that, he draws up a list of key players. He decides to start with the only eyewitness, Linda Lewis, the bartender, and quickly discovers a disturbing fact.
I went through Linda Lewis's phone records and found that there were some odd calls that were made in the days before the murder from Scottsdale. And this was the very spot where drug smugglers were flying into with one of their operations.
According to the phone records, the calls begin a few days before Era's murder, and Linda gets several only hours before the killers arrive at the bar. Was Linda a middleman in a drug network? Did Era find out and set up a meeting with police to spill the beans, or was he in on it with her? Mark can't help but wonder if Linda set up his father. Under the guise of a reunion, he arranges to meet her for dinner.
I went to visit her with my tape recorder sewn into the pocket.
But as the evening goes on, it becomes clear to Mark that Linda is up to something.
About every half an hour to 40 minutes, she would excuse herself and go to the bathroom. And I thought, gee, this is weird. Maybe she's got a tape recorder as well, and she's flipping over the tapes every 30, 45 minutes.
By her third trip to the bathroom, Mark is convinced his suspicion is correct.
I said, Linda, are you recording this conversation?
He grabs her purse and something falls out.
It was a bottle of vodka. She was going to the bathroom and sneaking drinks. I determined eventually that, that she was very honest, and the account she was giving was very consistent with what she had given police 17, 18 years earlier.
Back at square one, Mark crosses Linda's name off his list, and one by one, he tracks down his father's former employees, patrons, golfing buddies, and business associates.
I interviewed hundreds of people. One of the first things I asked was, can you tell me about my father? Was he living another life?
Then, late one night, he gets a call from a police contact who's come across a box of old case files which contain evidence of a strange business deal.
I was able to determine that in the weeks before my father's murder, that he had given $20,000 to a man who owned a nightclub in the middle of Fresno.
According to police records, the man, Stanley Bauer, was involved with drug dealers.
The business partner had taken my dad's money and invested in this drug ring. Now that raised the question, did my dad know or not know about that?
For the next month, Mark digs through newspapers and court files, but as he assembles all of the evidence, it soon becomes clear that Era was being deceived by his new partner and was furious when he learned his investment went to buy drugs.
My dad found out about it and was going to the narcotics agents, and in fact, they were having court hearings the day after the murder on this case.
This explains the meeting with police discovered in Era's datebook so many years ago. Bauer is now Mark's #1 suspect, and Mark quickly locates him.
When I went to see him, he was actually living in this golf course kind of community. Here's this guy who's lived 17, 18 years with the leisure of playing golf, and my dad's, dead. I said, my dad gave you this money, you turned this money over to a drug operation. And he said, no, I didn't. He's explained it away as just a robbery. It was just a robbery.
Mark continues to press him, but Bauer refuses to budge.
I got angry. I think there was some anger that came out in my questioning. I had to keep myself in check.
And as the interview comes to a close, Mark has become convinced of one thing.
Who killed my father? I had no idea. Who hired them? I had a pretty decent idea.
But without solid evidence implicating Bauer, Mark has little choice but to close down the investigation. He returns full-time to journalism, and in 1996 publishes a book about his journey called In My Father's Name.
What I hoped was that someone might read the book, someone involved, and see the price that we paid as a family, and say, you know what, it's time to solve this thing for this family.
But Mark has all but given up hope of finding the killers when 4 years later he gets a startling phone call. It's a detective with the Fresno Police Department.
And he said, well, I think we've solved your father's murder. And I said, what? He said, yeah, I think we've solved it.
28 years after his father's murder, Mark Arax gets a phone call that shocks him. The Fresno police believe they found his father's killers.
I was obviously stunned. I wanted all the details right then.
1 hour later, Mark meets with the detective who shows him photographs of the two suspects, Thomas Azurkis and Charles Silvani, and they look exactly like the police sketches from 1972.
And I knew that I was looking into the eyes that my father had looked into almost 30 years before. It was an emotional moment, but I remember, tearing up a little bit.
The detective reveals that the tip came from an informant who's currently sharing a cell in federal prison with Azurkis. Then, step by step, they walk Mark through the final moments of his father's life. In December 1971, a few days before the murder, a regular from Era's bar named Sue Gage meets two ex-cons, Thomas Azurkis and Charles Silvani.
Azurkis and Silvani decided to do a robbery. Sue Gage told them, I'll send you to Fresno, to a nightclub where I go, and you can rob that place.
Sue assures them that after New Year's, the bar will be loaded with cash and no one will be there. She then helps them find a getaway driver, a friend of hers, Larry Frazier, who also hangs out at Era's bar.
Larry Frazier, by his own admission, lived a highly criminal lifestyle.
The three men arrive in Fresno on January 2nd, 1972. Frazier lets Azurkis and Silvani off at the bar, where they order beers and case the joint.
They went to one of the pool tables and played a game of pool.
They left, came back 10 minutes later. One of them walked directly to the office.
It's Charles Silvani who heads straight back to Era's office, where he keeps the safe.
The other one stayed in front of the bartender. She asks him, do you want another beer? And he gives her a funny look. And the next thing she hears is gunshots.
Terrified, the bartender ducks behind the counter.
Once the guns were pulled or displayed Era made an aggressive move towards them.
In the back office, Era is putting up a fight, wrestling with the shooter, Charles Silvani, for the gun.
My dad actually took the gun away and shot and hit the man in the shoulder, and then the gun jammed.
The Zirkus came up and fired 2 shots, and those were the fatal shots. He went down and they fled into the fog.
Larry Frazier is out there. He takes them out about 20 miles west of the bar. They dump the car, dump the guns, and he drives them back to Los Angeles.
After years of investigating drugs and organized crime conspiracies, Mark is shocked to learn that the killing was exactly as Stanley Bauer described it, just a robbery gone bad. Detectives try to interview Thomas Azurkis in prison, but he won't talk, so they compare Azurkis' fingerprints to the ones collected by the police 28 years earlier, and they're a direct match. As for Charles Silvani, he is mysteriously found dead after a fall from the roof of a parking garage.
It was classified as a suicide, but there was no suicide note.
Next, the detectives track down Larry Frazier, the getaway driver, and bring him in for questioning. He's long since put his criminal past behind him, but he's never stopped thinking about what he did that night to the Araks family.
He remembered me as a kid, 12, 13, in my Little League uniform at the bar. And he felt very guilty after reading the book. He said that he almost contacted me and told me the truth.
But Frazier couldn't work up the courage to make the phone call. Now, both to make amends and to obtain immunity, Frazier testifies against Azurkis.
We granted Larry Frazier what we call use immunity. Any of the statements he made in the course of this trial could not be used against him in the future.
The trial of Thomas Azurkis lasts just 10 days. He is convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. 30 years after Era Araks' murder shattered the lives of his family, his killer is finally behind bars, his good name cleared, and the past put to rest.
I think Mark got out of this journey a sense of renewed pride in my dad and who he was and what he stood for.
I think my father would be proud that I did what I did. I'm hoping that he would be proud of the man I became. And I think he would tell me that, that it's over.